Fantastic. So welcome everyone to the next installment of our DiMe Virtual Journal Club series. Today, I'm first of all thrilled you can join us, and second, I'm really excited that Jessie, Bakker, Alan, Godfrey, and Bill Wood will be leading a discussion of a really tremendous piece of work done by the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, or CITI. One of the things that's really important to us at DiMe is not just doing our own work, but shining a light and recognizing the sort of extraordinary contributions of our colleagues in the field and making sure that our members are aware of these efforts. So as I mentioned, we're recording this for our other DiMe colleagues to access in the future. And with that, Jessie, I know you're going to be moderating the discussion, so I'll hand over to you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Jen. Thank you for setting this up and organizing everything and for that introduction. And many thanks also to Alan and Bill, who have, done really awesome, valuable work and helped throughout this process as well. So Bill, Alan, plus anyone else on the call, please feel free to interrupt and chat. That's really the whole point of this session. I am going to start by giving a brief overview of what we did. The slides are reasonably detailed, as we wanted people to be able to review them later if needed and have them all make sense. But I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, at least in the introduction of this conversation, because I just want to leave enough time for questions and discussions. But having said that, I'll reiterate what I said earlier. Please feel free to stop me, to chat, to interrupt, whatever we need to make sure that we cover the topics that everyone has in mind. Okay, so look, as I'm sure everyone is aware, we are seeing increasing use of mobile technologies and digital tools as a means of capturing safety or efficacy endpoint data in trials. But one of the most difficult aspects of this process is identifying the right tool and making sure that it's going to do the job. One key point that was included in the CTTI recommendations is to undertake a feasibility study. And by that, I mean a small or small-ish pilot study designed to test the selected tool end to end and make sure it's appropriate. And there are many advantages to doing this kind of feasibility study, some of which I've listed on these bullet points here. However, what we are seeing is that, well, what we suspect, I should say, is that feasibility studies are not always published in the peer-reviewed literature. A lot of the times they're performed by the sponsor, so say a pharma company, but then they remain internal to that company, and therefore others can't necessarily learn from what's already been done. Amongst those papers that are published, we see a lot of variability in methodology and also the way that those studies are reported. And so in doing the study that I'm about to describe, our objective was to perform a review of the literature and create an accessible database that summarizes key elements of these feasibility or pilot studies. And in doing so, what we hoped is that it would provide us with a means of promoting standardization of methodology and reporting. It should ideally encourage collaboration by establishing research links between various investigators and companies. Hopefully it will demonstrate value in publishing these papers and really promote that, and therefore avoid redundancies. I'm going to quickly pause before I get into how we identified the studies that we eventually summarized, and just make sure that nobody has questions before we move on. Okay. All right. So this table summarizes the inclusion criteria that we used to identify studies that eventually made their way into our database. I'm not going to go through this point by point, but basically what we were looking for was studies with human participants in a specified therapeutic area that used some kind of mobile technology or digital tool for objective outcome data collection, so that's efficacy or safety, with the aims of evaluating either the sensor, the algorithm, human factors and usability testing, adherence, and or data completeness. So we worked with a medical librarian who helped us create some search terms that we then put into PubMed, covering the period of 2014 to mid-2018. And those search terms identified just under 3,500 articles. We excluded a handful of those papers because they were reviews or case studies. And then we went through the titles, the abstracts, and eventually the full text. A number of reviewers went through this independently. And what we boiled down to was a final data set of 275 appropriate studies. So my next two slides, and after that I'm going to stop talking, give a high-level overview of kind of what we gleaned from those 275 studies. The first thing to note is the therapeutic area. The two most common were neurology and musculoskeletal disorders, with those remaining therapeutic areas listed on the slide in decreasing order, although we had many more that are not listed on this slide. The most common objectives of the feasibility studies was to assess the algorithm itself. So either develop the algorithm or validate it in a new data set. But we also had many studies that looked at sensor performance, the operational feasibility and logistics, and a handful of studies that looked at software development. The variability in the sample size of these studies was really very large, from 1 to 625, but the median was 33, which is kind of, what we would expect in for pilot and feasibility studies. Several studies used more than one type of tool or technology. So overall, we ended up with 321 different technologies, the majority of which were wearables. And so by that, we mean actigraphy or wrist-worn devices like smartwatches, clothing, chest straps, patches, and Holter monitors. The remaining tools were tablets and smartphones, implantables, so that would be something like, for example, a continuous glucose monitor, or cameras. We didn't identify any studies that used ingestible sensors. However, if we had come across them, they would have been within scope. The final thing I'll touch on before describing the database and then pausing is that we noted some areas of missing data. So for example, the software that was used to process the data was reported in 73% of the 275 studies. The comparator measure, where applicable, was reported in 83%. 15% of the studies did not provide a summary of the sex or gender of the participants, and 9% did not report a summary of the participant age. However, all reported the sample size and described the type of technology. Having said that, there was a lot of variability in how the technologies were described. So, for example, we saw words like motion sensor, accelerometer, triaxial accelerometer, all different terms getting at more or less the same thing. And some papers were even less specific, so they would refer to something like a pedometer without necessarily listing the actual sensors that are contained within that tool. The 275 studies and counting are now included in the CTTI study database, which is publicly accessible. So anyone can jump online, and I've got a link later on, and can search the database either by using a keyword or by filtering, as you can see with these little blue crosses. And then the studies out of the total database that meet those criteria are then displayed in a huge long list, which can then be downloaded. Another cool feature about this database is that anyone can submit their own paper or another paper that they're aware of for potential addition to the database. So these papers might be, for example, published either before or after the 2014 to 2018 search. They may not have been picked up in our original search terms, or perhaps they were picked up, but they were excluded for some reason. So by having this there, it means that we can continue to update the database and maintain it over time, because as we all know, this field is moving quickly and new papers seem to come out every day. And it means that we can continually make adjustments to make sure that our search terms remain appropriate given the speed at which this technology is progressing. I'm going to pause there and we'll get into the discussion. But one more thing to note is that we had a pretty big group of co-authors. The CTTI team did an amazing job of, all of the project management and logistics, which is challenging with big groups. We had a multidisciplinary team, so everyone was coming at this question and tackling the problem with different backgrounds and different training, which was really important because, obviously we discovered pretty quickly that an engineer will use quite different search terms than somebody trained in clinical science, for example. And on a personal level, what was really great about working on this study was that it led to a deliverable, and by that I mean the database, in real time. So the paper came out and anyone reading the paper can click on the link, head over to the CTTI database and begin using it. And I think that's the first and only time in all of my papers anyway, that there has been something delivered that's of value and immediate benefit to others. So I just personally found that very rewarding, and I'm sure many of the co-authors did as well. Okay, I'm going to stop there and open this up for discussion. Maybe the first thing I'll do is call on Alan and Bill to see if they have anything to add or other reflections throughout this whole process.
Yeah, thanks, Jessie. I think that was really a really insightful overview of the whole process, and certainly I echo your comments with regards all the sterling work that the City Group did, and Jennifer included, in pulling us all together, making sure that we met our deadlines and produced something that's really valuable and worthwhile. I suppose the kind of elephant in the room really with regards to city databases and the challenge for us this time last year was knowing where to draw our line in the sand with regards to cutoff in terms of the year with regards to search for the longevity of the studies that we include within the database. Obviously, we could have gone back much further, I think, to 2010 and so on and so forth, to include a lot of other different studies. But I think, given the novelty of the development of the technology and how, even as you just said yourself, every day a new paper gets published with the development of a piece of hardware or an algorithm, I think we did quite well to draw the line in the sand when we did, to actually make sure that we captured enough studies to give value to the database and to let those that engage with it a real flavor of the type of technologies that are currently available, and obviously an insight as to where this field of research is going as well.
This is Bill. I echo Alan and Jessie's comments. It was really a privilege to be part of this project, and I agree that it was quite rewarding to have a deliverable at the end that's useful to the community. I think another high-level observation, having participated in this, is how multidimensional the concept of feasibility is with regard to these types of technologies. I think that sometimes when people think about feasibility, which can mean many things to many people, they simply think about whether or not a technology could be used in a population of individuals and whether it would return any useful data. And I suspect all of us know that there's much more to it than that when thinking about mobile technologies. But I think that this review really helped to bring that out, and also to point to the need for, I think, more rigor in how we are actually looking at the different dimensions of feasibility and whether or not something is fit for purpose. There's clearly a lot of work to do in this field, and I really saw this effort as being one way to just start to get our hands around the diversity of work that has been done in recent years, and to point the way towards perhaps more agreement around conventions and reporting moving forward.
Yeah, I think the benefit of this database as well is that, Jessie alluded to the fact that it was created by a multidisciplinary team, and it really is for every type of multidisciplinary end user. I mean, I logged onto it myself yesterday because I wanted to check out a few things with regards to type of sensor, and I think it really speaks to numerous different disciplines, engineering and all the way through to the clinical sciences. So I think that's one of the key things to highlight of this as well. It transcends a lot of different areas of expertise to make it really user-friendly and really pragmatic for this area of work.
Hi, this is Jerry Fisher. I'm an endocrinologist in San Antonio. and coming from a diabetes technology background, one of the things I've wondered about over the years watching our field just go head first into technology is how much even these clinical trials interact or interfere with lifestyle or sense of well-being. What I worry about is that we do these studies, particularly with glucose monitors and diabetes glucose downloads, predictive glucose information, is how much this interferes with the patient's normal life or causes an artificial effect that will not last if you take it beyond a study. So I guess in feasibility, I wonder if there's a way to look at the psychological profile or the patient-reported outcomes effect.
Hi, this is Pam Tenarts. I'm with Citi, and one of the things that I would say to that is that is absolutely true. And in addition to creating this feasibility database, we also had a project that talked to participants and sites about their sort of views on using technology into clinical trial and how, so that their user experiences and what to take into account, because the whole reason we took this work on in making, sort of creating a set of recommendations around appropriate use of mobile technologies is that our goal is to improve quality and efficiency of clinical trials. And so to the extent that mobile technology is used, it should be to make it better and easier, not to make it more complex. So I think your comment is very is very pointed, and we cannot lose sight that this is not just to, include technology into a clinical trial, but really with the goal to capture better endpoint, make it better for the participant to participate, and all those kind of things.
Jesse, would I be
echo those points.
Would I be accurate in saying, Jesse, that a lot of the studies that were captured by the database and the searching didn't actually have any qualitative measures of feasibility and how accurate or how good the technology was for the normal kind of day-to-day functioning of the patient's life?
Yes, I think that is accurate. I don't have numbers off the top of my head, but yes, I don't think that was very common throughout the the studies that we looked at and extracted data from. But this is such an important thing to bring up, and I'm glad it was one of the first questions to come up in this session, because as Bill mentioned, feasibility means a lot of different things. I think there's a tendency often to focus on just the tool itself, how accurate are the sensors and how robust are the algorithms, but there is a lot of other things that need to be considered, such as patient acceptability, usability testing, how that impacts adherence and data completeness. And these are all things that can be looked at least to some extent, in a feasibility study before jumping into, a multi-center, multi-year clinical trial, only to find that, as we've been discussing, that the sensors themselves are impacting the participants' quality of life in ways that perhaps the investigators weren't aware of or didn't anticipate upfront.
Yeah, I think that's probably reflective due to the fact that a large proportion of the papers included are actually stemming from an engineering discipline. So, I can say this because I'm an engineer, but most engineers probably won't engage with the end user when they're designing or developing an algorithm or a piece of hardware. So, yeah, I suppose that's a limitation with the type of papers that we found, that it didn't actually include any qualitative feedback from the end user.
Yeah, and I think one other contingent of the contingency on the database is that we did not make a judgment as to whether something was a good feasibility study or maybe a lesser feasibility study. This is simply the listing that met the criteria. We did not, kind of create a good. This isn't the Better Business Bureau feasibility study database necessarily. This is just a thing. Yeah.
For sure. I suppose the onus is really on those that produce the engineering papers to actually make sure that they do engage with the end user, and rather than just generating a p-value based on the accuracy of the outcome that they're trying to quantify, for example, that they do actually have some qualitative feedback to determine if the device that is created would actually be suitable for deployment in large population-based studies, and actually if the end user themselves would be happy to use it for longitudinal assessment.
Yeah, I think
this is Bill, and I didn't mention before my background's in clinical oncology. So I think about these issues quite a bit, and I think I just wanted to call it a really important element of that first question as well, which is probably something we need to work on further as a field. and that's around engagement, which really can go both ways. We often think about technologies as ones that should be engaging for a good experience and to help with adherence. And on the other hand, I think you alluded to the Hawthorne effect, where quite possible that optimal engagement could actually lead to artificial results in a population that uses these technologies compared to one that doesn't, and that sometimes we can see that when the trial's over and whatever effect had existed has worn off. So I think that we might be able to get a little bit of that at the feasibility level. We didn't see a lot of that, as Jessie mentioned, in this particular database, but I do wonder if that's something that we need to be thinking about as a field a little bit more around the effects of engagement on trial results. So thank you for that question.
Well, actually, one other point is that these studies all end up going into real-world settings, and you've got ethnicity issues where comprehension of the interface varies upon what your background is, and then it kind of segues into, for example, the American Association of Diabetes Educators has a database of all the zillion apps that are not vetted, and I'd see this as a place to start to allow the AED to then pull those apps that move on to make sure they're not just feasible, but then they're used in the real world. Because again, in endocrinologic diabetes, we have so many apps out there, trying to carve into the patient care space, and finding which is the best one or the best to breed has always been a challenge, because some of it's related to which meter you use, which sensor you use. So I think this is a good place for us to use as a base and then go into the real world testing.
Hi, this is Colleen Russell. I have a question sort of, again, related to the feasibility issue, and I've heard the word accuracy being used to describe the studies as well as a goal. I'm wondering what percentage of the studies that you reviewed actually have two like devices being used by a subject or a group of subjects, and have the results from the devices, the two like devices, compared to each other?
That is an interesting question. I'm hoping maybe Jen has a better memory than me in terms of how frequent that was. But certainly I personally am aware of several studies that have compared, for example, and I hope this is getting at your question, multiple wrist-worn devices in an attempt to compare them not only for sensor accuracy, but also the validation of the algorithm that provides the study endpoint, whether it be something like steps or sleep or whatever the clinical construct is. Mm-hmm. Jen, I'm not sure. Do you happen to remember, how often we saw that?
And we also have the current project manager of that project on the call. Lindsay is currently doing. So if Jen doesn't remember or does remember, Lindsay can maybe remember too.
Oh, fantastic! Yes, Lindsay, thank you. If either of you or anyone can recall that, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I certainly can't, speak to the exact numbers for the previous, for the 2014 to the 2018. What I'll say is that we're in, as this is a live database, of course, we're doing annual reviews and updates, and so we're currently in the midst of that right now. I will say that we are coming across some of those articles in our current review. Forgive me, I don't have the exact numbers at this point, but it is something that we are seeing and coming across in a few of our articles.
I would say that all the CGM studies in the last 2 or 3 years all use paired sensors on patients, so I'd imagine that would fit into that ballpark.
Mm-hmm. And it may be something that we can even, as one of our categories that we list in the database, we do kind of list the various different sensors and things that are used, and it may be something that we can kind of pull out from there and kind of get those numbers for you and get back to you here shortly with what those numbers are looking like.
Great,
I just want to use this opportunity to flag another issue that I know DiMe is working on, and that is around verification and validation. And I think that many times these comparative studies often raise a question, compared to what, and I've certainly seen that a lot around, comparing wrist-worn accelerometers, for example, looking at steps. But I think if you actually take it back to first principles and say, how do we actually believe the data coming from a sensor, there are ways to, I think, really deconstruct that in a thoughtful way. I know that the concept of gold standard obviously is a controversial one, but we can at least get back to first principles around describing these concepts, and that's an area that parts of DiMe are also wrestling with at this moment.
Bill, I'm glad you brought that up, because one thing I was wondering is, I know you're collecting with DiMe sort of a catalog of endpoints, and I wonder if there would be value in connecting the dots between these two activities to sort of lead people to a potential feasibility study and vice versa. I wonder if there's some value in doing something like that.
I think that's a wonderful idea. That's definitely something that, Jen, you and I could continue to talk about moving forward, cross-referencing these activities. Been a couple of different things have been brought up as yet another project that we're spending a little bit of time working on, which is to develop a catalog of endpoints initially in industry-sponsored studies that can be referenced in much the same way that a feasibility studies database might be referenced. So much exciting work going on. I don't know, Jen, if you want to comment any further on that.
First of all, Pam, I think that's a terrific idea. And I think the more of these sorts of resources we can put together, the better, right? To allow our colleagues in the field to have an understanding of what sort of peer organizations and investigators are working on, and to ensure that we're not sort of reinventing the wheel, but also perhaps to evaluate where we're making particular strides and where a particular therapeutic area or class of tool or class of measure is gaining a little bit more traction and perhaps is closer to broad acceptance than others. And that leads me to a question for Jessie, Alan, and Bill. In your comments, and I agree with you 100%, I think the definition of feasibility study is quite nebulous, right? It's feasibility study, feasibility of what aspect of it is it, capturing accurate sample level data? Jerry, you made a great point about, feasibility of, deploying it in the field. When we think about the city database as a resource, like, how do you imagine it being most valuable to users? At what point in their decision-making around using a technology or not in a clinical setting should they be accessing this resource?
So I guess my simplistic response to that would be as soon as possible and early, as in, there is a lot to learn from what other people have already done, and potentially, issues, or I don't want to call them mistakes, but, logistical things that are important to know up front. Another piece of value that I hope would be gleaned by accessing the database very early in this decision-making process is thinking about other aspects of feasibility that maybe that investigator hadn't thought about. So Jen, exactly what you were referring to, maybe somebody is out there looking for a tool that provides a really robust estimate of sleep, but they haven't thought about the fact that it requires the user to do X, Y, and Z, and that, it doesn't have a long battery life, or, whatever the logistical or usability issue might be, that they need to know about upfront. Because sometimes, even though you might have a tool that provides a really robust estimate of whatever endpoint you're trying to capture, if that tool, there might be other aspects of that tool that could be a deal breaker for including it in a study. So for example, something as simple as battery life or the method of data transmission. If that doesn't fit into the framework of the study, then something has to change. Either the investigator identifies a different tool or they change their study design. And so, those are really big picture questions. And so I'd hope that the database is something that investigators are encouraged to access and review and access the original papers early in the study design phase.
Yeah, I definitely
agree with that.
Yeah, definitely. Just in terms of additional to what Jessie said, I think it's just a really good educational tool to make those that are trying to use wearable devices more aware of where they could be used in other patient groups. So there are a number of devices that have been included on the database, for example, that are useful in providing raw accelerometer data values. So if the researcher is interested in using that particular device, then hopefully they would become a little bit more educated on that the devices are normally ubiquitous. I mean, an accelerometer is an accelerometer, but hopefully then the database will make them more aware that it's how you interpret those data, and the creation of different types of algorithms, and how those algorithms are then interpreting the data for use within a particular patient cohort.
Yeah, I totally agree with Alan and Jessie's comments here again. And, you know, I think, again, that the earlier the better. I think this is one way of really doing a vetted search at the outset of thinking about use of a technology in a project. But I think it also points to kind of the next, you know, iteration or future directions for this type of a project. I mean, I tend to really like things like checklists and labels and these kinds of things. And I think being able to really call out what are the different dimensions of feasibility, and, you know, do these studies address or not address these different dimensions, and which remain unaddressed, I think would also be very useful to the end user.
Yeah, and to that point, you know, I think, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Lindsay, you go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, I think internally there's a lot to be said even on what kind of metrics can we pull from how the database is being used, and what will be kind of the quality elements there that we can really start assessing whether it's the particular types of studies that are being downloaded most often, or how people are kind of really entering in their search term criteria. What are they looking for when they first come on, and what can we learn from that?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think the database can be really useful for people as well if they're doing their own systematic review search, that, you know, the database is a good method for them to really have good rigor in terms of searching for the devices. So going forward, it could be an additional tool, as alluded to in the paper, where people are not only just registering the devices, but using it as a pragmatic means to research the different types of algorithms, etc., that have been developed with wearables.
So I have a potentially provocative, you know, question or perhaps statement to throw down for folks to react to. I was actually at a mobile and clinical trials conference yesterday, and there was a lot of folks talking about the really important sort of end user testing, Jerry, the sort of thing that you were describing, and I think that everyone on the line will agree is critically important to determining the success of the tool. I'd venture, and I'm very happy for some pushback, but one of the things I see as being really important about this repository of feasibility studies is, you know, I'd go as far as saying it's potentially unethical even to start deploying these tools for usability testing in a patient population, unless you know the underlying technology has some level of acceptable performance. I think it's a waste of everyone's time and effort. You know, and I've seen it before where folks haven't sort of checked the sensor performance before asking patients to engage with it. And I think being able to do a quick reference check of this kind of resource to see that it has undergone some rigorous testing before deploying it seems like a really valuable, excuse me, a really valuable use of this particular tool.
Jen, it's Colleen again. If I could add on to that, based on the little bit that I've learned from my experience, I think that the ability to go into this tool and look at the kind of variability, not just within patient, but between patients. As a statistician, I'm thinking, how do you power, you know, these studies? I realize there was a median of 33 here sample size, but I'm wondering, oh, how did they get that? And so I'm actually really interested to go in and see, you know, what sorts of assumptions were they making? Were they making assumptions based on the traditional clinical endpoint, or did they have some data that really reflected the real kind of variability that is observed when it's out in the real world?
Well, this is Jerry again. I might comment that, you know, I'm working with, you know, some startups, and the ability to not make, you know, first line mistakes by at least choosing the right tool with a, you know, like any tool they use for a trial is definitely helpful. You know, it cuts down the time for mistakes, for having to go back and do things over again. So this becomes an important way to at least get past that blockade that many startups have of getting halfway into a study, realize they looked at the wrong things, used the wrong tool, and had the wrong endpoints.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with these last three comments. And Jen, I'm also aware I've become aware of situations where, you know, in an effort to satisfy patient engagement, which is critically important in study design, you know, that an investigator's pulled together a focus group or a user group or something like that, and presented a whole lot of different options. But then the particular example I'm thinking of ended up in this kind of bizarre situation where the focus group attendees selected one particular tool that they used and they liked the form factor, they found it comfortable, it, you know, satisfied what they needed. However, it wasn't actually very good at generating the outcome of interest. And so there's got to be a balance between these two things. Patient engagement and providing options and getting potential users on board early in the study design period is really important. And I think that's happening more and more, which is really great to see. But it's also important for ethical and scientific integrity reasons to present options that are going to get the job done and select from within those. So yeah, Jen, getting back to your original comment, I do think it's you know, yeah, borderline unethical to put out a tool in the field without first knowing that it satisfies everything that it needs in order to optimize the chances of study success.
You know, on the other hand, I think that that having been said, there aren't necessarily a lot of roadblocks to doing these types of studies with tests that don't meet that bar as much as important as we think that bar might be. And so I think part of this is an educational message as well, to get these kinds of concepts out into the community for wider use. I mean, you know, we think about it, you know, many times people will do studies with unvalidated patient-reported outcome questionnaires, for example. And sometimes those studies provide useful information. They may even contribute to validation over the long run. Not a very fair analogy because we're not talking about the underlying verification and validation of the tool in the way that we are with some of these mobile tools. Nonetheless, I think that there's an important educational mission here and an importance of agreement around standards and terms so that we can determine whether or not technologies have met appropriate criteria to move forward into testing.
Completely agree, and I'll add one more point to that, and that is that one particular tool might be perfectly fit for purpose and appropriate for one study, but not necessarily for another. So that's an assessment that needs to be done on a kind of a case-by-case basis. It's not, it's probably never going to be as simple as, you know, this is the perfect tool for every study.
I guess a general question is, Jerry, again, in your list of criteria, did you have anything about security issues of the technology? Since that's a big focus, you know, we see a lot of things we're doing here lately.
I'm just scrolling back so that everyone can see that particular slide when I eventually get there. But the short answer is no. That wasn't data security or data transmission methods were not something that we specifically filtered on when we were identifying the 275 studies.
And not to say that we don't think it's important. I'm sorry, Jessie, go ahead.
No. I'm glad you raised that. Thank you, Alan. Go ahead.
No, it's Bill. I was just going to say, I think we all recognize this is a critically important issue, but one can clearly feasibly do a study with problematic security and data rights issues. While not necessarily fitting within the scope of feasibility, I think it's a critical question for new technologies that needs to be considered.
And you know what, Bill, I think that's a terrific answer, and I think it's really important. And I think it circles back to this idea, and Jerry, thanks for asking the question, that feasibility studies are critically important, but they aren't the silver bullet. I think feasibility studies can address a number of different aspects and are foundational, but they're not the sort of the be all and end all. And I think that, you know, that became increasingly apparent to me through the course of the work and the more time we spend in the field. And frankly, I'd venture to say, Jerry, that I think security is actually not yet on everyone's radar, and I think that that's something we collectively should be aware of and pushing for as sort of the next wave of sort of thinking and establishing sort of minimum viable product standards around security as we deploy these things with patients.
You know, it's come up with people hacking into pumps and stuff lately, so we're all getting a little paranoid, for rightfully or wrongfully.
Right, and I think I mentioned up front that this whole issue of performing a feasibility study or pilot testing was one recommendation of many that are included in the CTTI documentation on mobile technologies across several different documents. And data security is one of the things that's addressed in those CTTI recommendations. But I agree, I think it's probably something that as a field, we perhaps don't focus on quite enough. So maybe sorry, go ahead.
I want to make sure we finish promptly. No, I was going to say, I want to make sure we finish promptly. I'd like to share some details of an upcoming webinar. But before we do, I wonder if, Lindsay, you might want to share with folks on the line, and Jessie, I think you have a lovely visual of it, of how folks can actually contribute feasibility studies that they might be aware of that they don't see in the database.
Absolutely, yeah. So as you might have seen from a previous slide, there is an option right there on the database for submitting a paper. You can see that there in the right-hand corner. We really do welcome the opportunity to review any papers that are submitted. Of course, you know, we would review that based on our criteria, our eligibility criteria. But of course, you know, this is something that if there is a paper that may have gone overlooked or something that should be included, maybe didn't get captured by our original search criteria, please do submit. We will work with the team and our internal team here and the team of participants that put this forth to kind of review that and include it into the database if it meets all of the criteria.
Lindsay,
and on that note,
can I quickly ask one question? When people submit a paper, will that then be considered once a year, or is that going to be included on a rolling basis, so to speak? Because currently we're only updating this thing once a year, right?
Right, but we are having quarterly reviews. So
okay.
I will be going into the database quarterly, and any submitted papers that have been put forth, we will kind of bring back. And if there is any question as far as inclusion into the database, we'll bring that up to the team.
Great, thanks for that clarification.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, I know we do need to wrap up pretty quickly, and Jen, I'll get to your final slide as well to discuss the next Journal Club and Ask Me Anything session. But just wanted to acknowledge and build off those comments to say that CTTI has been fantastic at providing resources to maintain this database. You know, led by Lindsay, but there's a lot of people that are contributing to that. And so, you know, I just wanted to kind of acknowledge the fact that CTTI is providing those resources, because maintaining this database and keeping it up to date is a huge part of its value. So we're all very appreciative.
I will need to jump in there, because I then need to clarify that the resources are being provided by a Food and Drug Administration grant and supported by membership fees as well. So anytime we present on our work, we kind of have to include the funding statement. So there, I did it.
Thank you, that is important. So I'm going to skip these. I didn't need those extra discussion points, but Jen, I'll hand it back to you to discuss our next session. Jen, you are currently muted.
Oh, well, thank you, Jessie. First of all, I was actually just thanking you and Bill and Alan for leading a great discussion this morning, and also for our attendees. I think that I certainly have been given some food for thought based on your excellent questions. So I appreciate you being part of this discussion. And Jessie, just to echo your sort of praise for the work that Citi's doing here. I think Citi, Pan, you and the rest of the team, and Lindsay on this project continue, I think, to lead the way on the use of these tools, specifically in clinical trials. So thank you for making this resource available. Quick plug, we do have monthly webinars and journal clubs. The next event is actually going to be a webinar where Megda from Sage Bionetworks will be working through and really sort of workshopping on their informed consent toolkit, with a particular focus on aspects and elements we should be thinking about when using digital medicine tools in research. So really excited about Meg leading that discussion, and hope you can join us on October 8th. Jessie, Bill, Alan, thanks so much. Thanks to all of our members for joining. And I'm really happy that you're all part of DiMe. I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.